My name is Philip Schofield. I'm Professor of Medieval History and Head of Department at Aberystwyth and Department of History and Welsh History. And I thought I'd like to take the opportunity to talk to you for about 20 minutes about pandemics. We're in the middle of one now, but for many years I've taught a first-year course on the Black Death, the plague that hit medieval Europe in the middle of the 14th century. And more than one historian working in this sort of area has reflected recently on the parallels between the plague of the 14th century and the present experience of coronavirus, Covid-19. So I thought I would just investigate or explore some of those issues with you. I'm going to focus on the Black Death, but I am going to conclude with a few thoughts on how it relates to our current experience, which we all share in different ways at the moment. My email, as you'll see, is prs@aber.ac.uk, and if you've got any questions following on from this or comments, I'd be delighted to hear them. Right, to begin, the Black Death, as I say, is a plague that hit Europe and previously Central Asia in the middle years of the 14th century. Key points are, and I'll return to these in a bit more detail in a moment, devastating mortality, a recurrence, that first outbreak of plague recurred throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern and indeed into the modern period. And it generated a series of responses that were social, economic, political, medical and religious. Basically, the Black Death infected every aspect of life in the Middle Ages, with consequences that were both short-term and long-term. Some historians, including economic historians, believe that the consequences of the Black Death lasted for centuries. To return to the beginning and to return to that first arrival of the plague is to notice how it moved in waves from the 1330s in Central Asia, travelling across the Central Asian steppes and into the East Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and then, as this map shows, moving in waves across Europe, including Western Europe, and eventually into Britain, the British Isles. And it's really the British Isles story from the period of late 1340 or mid 1348 onwards for a couple of years that interests us, and that's what I'll be dwelling on here. Commentators at the time, this is a writer describing the arrival of the plague in London in the summer of 1348, noticed that the plague arrived at about the Feast of All Saints, so actually a bit later into the autumn. Daily deprived many of life. It grew so powerful that between Candlemas, February and Easter 1349, more than 200 corpses were buried almost every day in the new burial ground made next to Smithfield. It ceased in London with the coming of the grace of the Holy Spirit, 31st of May, and then headed north and where it proceeded, and then stopped around Michaelmas. That's the autumn of 1349. So in England, which is what Robert of Avebury is describing, the plague spread throughout over a year throughout the country. We know now, in a way that we didn't 20 years ago, because of modern scientific technique and archaeology, we know that the disease that people in the Middle Ages confronted was very much the same as modern bubonic plague. So the Black Death was very close to this disease that we're familiar with still in the modern era, which is bubonic plague. Examination of the graves of plague victims, and especially examination of their dental pulp, has shown us that these people were victims of plague. A few years ago, as I say, we wouldn't have been able to detect this, and there were lots of different theories as to what the disease actually was, but now modern scientific technique has confirmed that the disease was bubonic plague. So what's bubonic plague? Bubonic plague is different at essence than something like the coronavirus. The coronavirus is a virus. The bubonic plague is a bacterium. They're both potentially deadly, and they both invade their hosts. But the bacterium is a living organism, and the bacterium, in the case of bubonic plague, is something called Yersinia pestis, or sometimes referred to as Pasteurella pestis, and it transfers, as is very well known, from animal to animal, host to host, typically through a flea. Bubonic plague prefers to live in rodents. It doesn't really like to live in humans, but now and again a flare-up of the disease in the rodent population causes it to spill over into the human population. And again, when we think of something like Covid-19, as far as we're aware, we're interested in that transference, or aware of that transference between an animal population and a human population. And that's certainly what seems to have happened with the creation of epidemics and then pandemics of bubonic plague in the Middle Ages, as happened later in the late 19th century when the modern identification of bubonic plague took place. So here you can see from this slide the three necessary vectors or components of plague: the bacillus itself, the Pasteurella pestis, the flea, which is the vector that translates or transfers the disease, and then hosts such as the rat or occasionally ourselves. So, confronted with a disease like bubonic plague, how did medieval society respond to it? The first point I should make is that modern bubonic plague is a deadly disease. Without current treatment, or without modern treatment, the survival chances for someone with bubonic plague are about the fatality rate is about 60%. And if you get the even more virulent versions of it, septicemic or pneumonic, then the mortality rate is closer to 90 to 100%. So it is a nasty disease. Whether the people in the Middle Ages suffered exactly the same disease is not entirely clear, but certainly one of the first responses that we would expect from a society confronted with bubonic plague is simply to die. And we do know that in that first outbreak in the middle of the 14th century, 45 to 50% of the population died in Britain over a 2-year period, or more particularly in England, where we have very good records. And we have records such as these, which are records of deaths of manorial tenants or serfs or villeins, and we can see peaks in their deaths. And this information comes not because someone was taking regular records of deaths, but when someone died, their land was transferred to someone else. So we get records from this kind of material. This peak is a famine in the early 14th century, but this peak is the Black Death. This is actually, you can see the sort of norm, and then the sudden surge in deaths, which I've ringed in blue there. So one immediate and very human and natural response, and certainly one that's familiar to us from our present experience of pandemic, is mortality. On the flip side of that, people also survive. Not everyone dies from the bubonic plague, but it does have dramatic effects in terms of population. This is a graph estimating the movement of population in the middle years of the 14th century and before. So this is English population estimates for the period before the Black Death, the falling away of population during the Black Death, and some speculation here in this graph in point 2 here about how population might have recovered slightly but kept being knocked back by recurrence of plague, and then a relatively stagnant population of survivors, which persists throughout the 15th century before, in what we refer to as the early modern period from the 16th century onwards, population slowly beginning to recover. So not everyone dies, even in pandemics of this kind, but there is a transformation to population. Again, we're very unlikely to see that kind of enormous transformation in this kind of episode, of course, for reasons we'll return to. Another response to the disease is simply to respond to it, to attempt to interpret it and to combat it. And in the Middle Ages, in the middle of the 14th century, we see both elements of that. We see an attempt to interpret the disease and to fight it. Interpretation comes in many ways in this period. It can come through religious, through faith, through pretty much everyone with the exception of a smaller Jewish population and in some parts of Europe a Muslim population. Pretty much everyone in this period were Catholic Christians who turned to God to interpret what was happening. Was this God's anger? Was there a way of reducing his anger by praying, by performing acts of penance? And certainly we see people doing that, as an example here of groups of people called flagellants who went through the countryside in Western Europe, beating themselves in imitation of the Passion of Christ in order to try to reduce God's anger. But also we know that medical men, scientists, began to postulate and think about the ways in which this disease happened and begin to think about ways in which they could deal with it. Their own understanding of the disease was limited. They did not know about the bacillus, they did not know about bacterium, they did not know about elements of transmission, but they did know enough to think about quarantining, separating people, trying to remove the ill from the proximity of the healthy. And began to apply their own understanding through observation in ways that were to different degrees effective. A third response, which is not necessarily one that's chosen, but which happens with an epidemic of this kind, is that things change. Things change socially, things change economically, things change politically, culturally, and religiously. To focus on one aspect here, which is religious, and you can see from this, which is economic, you can see from this graph where the Black Death occurs, and what happens after the Black Death, slowly but inexorably, is a change in the economic landscape of the later Middle Ages. We see a reduction in population, which we've already briefly discussed, and that has consequences because those people that are left are no longer in the same economic landscape as they were before. In the period before the Black Death, people were probably too many in medieval England, which put enormous pressure on resources and encouraged events like famine and shortage. After the Black Death, when maybe 45% of the population were killed, suddenly those that survived were relatively advantaged. And we see in this period things like wage rates beginning to rise. We see prices beginning to decline as the pressure on resources reduces. And the 15th century, for those generations that survived the Black Death, is often considered to be a relative golden age. So out of that adversity, for some came opportunity and a relative longer-term advantage. So how do these things compare with Covid-19? There are some early familiar patterns. We can see disruption, dislocation. Sadly, we can see death, though thankfully not on the same scale or the level of mortality that the population of the 14th century experienced. We can also see people searching for explanations and solutions. We're aware regularly of discussion of different medicines, different kinds of interventions, different kinds of social solutions. We're familiar already with terms like social distancing and self-isolation, and we are also incredibly, all of us, familiar, I suspect, with aspects of medical intervention and of virology and of epidemiology, terms that we wouldn't really have encountered very much before, but are suddenly encountering a lot. And we're aware that a lot of these are scientific, a lot of these are sensible. We can get a sense of governments having to intervene to try to get us to do the right thing, which is certainly what governments were doing in 14th century England as well, in different measure. But we're also aware of less sensible solutions. So we see people trying to identify things like radio or phone masts as potential distributors of the disease, for example, or people selling spurious types of cure. These are things that in different ways were also evident in the Middle Ages, where people turned on different social groups and accused populations like the Jews or travellers or lepers of being potentially contaminants or causes of the disease or justification for God's anger, and that's why the disease had been meted on the wider population. So people in these sort of crises range in their search for explanations, and some of those explanations are calm and sensible and considered and measured, and some of them are hot-headed and irresponsible and ill-considered. Those are experiences that people had in the 14th century, and to some extent we're seeing some of that now. We're also hearing a lot about the short, medium and longer term consequences of this. People are thinking about the economic consequences now in terms of disruption, but also in the longer term. Will there be different sorts of social consequences? Will people be adjusting their mode of behaviour? Will that have both negative effects in terms of maybe the economy, but also benefit in terms of things like the environment, climate, a reduction in greenhouse gases? These are the sort of interesting questions that that no doubt will be continued to explore. In many respects, it's far too early to tell. One of the big consequences of the Black Death was that it rolled on in different ways, not just for a few years, but for decades and indeed for centuries. Whether Covid-19 has the same sort of long-lasting consequence seems relatively less likely. The big difference of the Black Death and Covid-19 was the extreme of mortality. What we may experience with Covid-19 is a sharper shock, but hopefully one that will be eventually resolved. But as I say, it really is far too early to tell. We're only literally in the first months of something. One last point, which I'd like to end with, and which I hope in some sense is a positive one for us, is that plague remains today. That might seem like a negative point to make, that the disease that people grappled with in the 14th century is still one that people grapple with today. But the difference is, and this map shows that plague remains in parts of Central Asia, in Africa, in parts of South America, and indeed even in countries like the USA, in the Rockies, in the western United States. But the big difference between the plague that people experienced in the 14th century and the modern disease, in essence the same bacterium, but we know how to deal with it. We know that by giving effectively antibiotics and throwing them at it, which I've just given some examples from the Centre for Disease Control website on this, that plague can be relatively easily resolved. And that, of course, is the quest for Covid-19 and coronavirus, and that's the big scramble. Our advantage, in contrast to the people of the Middle Ages, is that we do have modern science on our side, and that we hope will help us to resolve and restore this situation relatively quickly. Thank you very much indeed for your attention. As I say, if you'd like to get back to me on any questions or pass me on comments, then please don't hesitate to do so, ideally by emailing me at prs@abba.ac.uk. Thank you.